In the next chapter, this is chapter 7, we're going to use the skills that we've learned so far to talk about how taxation and government intervention affect a market. The kinds of things that we're going to be talking about in this chapter is show how when a market is in equilibrium, it maximizes what economists call consumer and producer surplus. Then we're going to demonstrate the burden of taxation to consumers and producers. We explain how government intervention is a type of implicit taxation, and then we're going to come up with a new term, one that you probably haven't seen before, called rent seeking. So let's get started. First of all, a couple of definitions. Consumer surplus. This is the value that a consumer gets from buying the product minus its price. Graphically speaking, it is the area below the demand curve and above the price. Producer surplus, that's the price the producer sells a product for less the cost of producing it. Graphically, it's the area above the supply curve but below the price the consumer receives. So let's take a look at the graph. Here we've got a graph with a demand curve and a supply curve. So remember, consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve that's above the market price. Producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the market price. Now we can calculate the size of the consumer and producer surplus simply by calculating the area of a triangle, which is 1/2 base times the height. So in the case of the consumer surplus, we've got a base of 5 and a height of 5. 1/2, 5 times 5, that's going to be 12.5. And we do the same thing for the producer surplus, which you find below. The total of consumer surplus and producer surplus gives us a concept we call total surplus. And we're going to be using that concept as we try to determine when a policy is enacted or when a tax is imposed, who is actually going to bear the burden of this policy instead of the question of who pays the tax or is affected directly by the policy. Okay, so let's run some examples here. We've got consumer surplus and we've got producer surplus. But now I want you to look at that triangle that is in the lighter blue. This is another concept that we need to put into our discussion, and that's called lost surplus. And the idea here is that if a policy is enacted that somehow changes equilibrium, one of the fallout from this is that some of that total surplus will be sacrificed. The economy won't gain as much as it would if the market was allowed to reach equilibrium. So let's consider taxation. Here we've got, let's start with the situation where there's no tax. So if there's no tax, market equilibrium is reached and total surplus is maximized. Again, you've got the consumer surplus that's in the pink, you've got the producer surplus that's in the purple. So let's consider what happens when they impose a tax. So here we've got a situation where a tax is imposed on the supplier. As a result of that, the supply curve shifts from S0 to S1. The consumer surplus, which was section A, B, and C, is now reduced to section only A. The producer surplus, which was D, E, and F, has now been reduced to only F. C and E represent the lost surplus, and B and D is the amount of money that is paid to the government in the form of a tax. Now, some of the costs of taxation are going to include, well, obviously the direct cost of the tax paid to the government, that's one. The deadweight loss that results from causing the market to no longer function in equilibrium. And finally, the company is going to have some administrative costs just to comply with the new regulation and to pay the tax. So these things sum up what we would consider the cost of taxation. The next question is, who bears the burden of a tax? And something you need to keep in mind is that the person or entity that physically pays the tax may not necessarily be the entity that bears the burden of the tax. And here we use some of the topics that we learned in chapter 6 about inelasticity. Basically, the more inelastic one's demand or supply, the larger the tax burden that you will bear. If demand is more inelastic than supply, consumers are going to bear the higher share. On the other hand, if supply is more inelastic than demand, suppliers will pay the higher share. So what kinds of goods should we tax? Well, if the goal of the government is to increase their revenue, but at the same time they want to limit the deadweight lost, they want to tax something where the demand or the supply is inelastic, something that people have very few substitutes, for instance, in buying, like things that have addictive qualities, things like cigarettes or something like that. However, if the goal of the government is to change people's behavior, in other words, discourage them from buying the good or selling the good, then it's most effective when the demand or supply is elastic. So that brings us to this final box. If the demand is inelastic and the supply is elastic, typically the consumers will bear the burden. If the supply is inelastic and the demand is elastic, it'll be the producers that are bearing the burden. When both the supply and demand are elastic, the burden is shared. However, the group whose supply or demand is more inelastic will end up bearing more of the burden. So let's go through some examples to see if we can illustrate this. Now, on the left, we're showing a demand curve that is relatively elastic. On the right, we're showing a demand curve that is relatively inelastic. So let's have a tax that's imposed and see what happens. Here's a tax that was imposed on the firms, not on the consumer. So you see that the supply curve will shift from S0 to S1. And what happens to the various surplus? In other words, who is bearing the burden of this? Well, we see in this case, there is a shift that causes more of the producer surplus to be lost than consumer surplus. So in this case, the producers pay more than the consumers. Now let's switch it around. Let demand be relatively inelastic. Same thing happens. The supply curve shifts from S0 to S1. But now consumers are going to be paying more. Their change in surplus is greater than the loss in surplus on the part of the producers. Can we calculate this burden of the tax? And the answer is yes. The fraction of the tax that is borne by the consumer, by the demander, is found by an equation where you take the supply elasticity and divide it by the sum of the demand, of the price, and the supply elasticities. If you want to find out what fraction of tax is borne by the supplier, similar calculation, but now the numerator has the demand elasticity on top. Again, the sum of the demand and the supply elasticities. Now, one other thing to point out, the tax burden is independent of who pays the tax. In our last example, we had the tax put on the producer. Now let's look at the same thing, but first put it on the producers, then on the consumer. So look on the graph that's on the left. We're going to have the tax paid by the producers. So again, we see the supply curve shift from S0 to S1. Here, now on the right, we see that the consumer is paying the tax. It'd be something like a sales tax. Now the demand curve shifts from D0 to D1. Now I want you to pay attention to what happens to the surplus in both cases, okay? Now what you see is that the amount of surplus that the producer gives up is shown in purple. The amount that the consumer gives up is shown in pink. And in both cases, the amount of surplus that is foregone is the same. In this case, the producer pays more of, bears more of the burden of the tax. Now let's think about some of these concepts as they relate to policy debates. So let's think about Social Security taxes. Now, the way Social Security taxes work, both the employer and the employee that contribute the same percentage of their wages to the Social Security Fund. Although they give the same amount to the Social Security Fund, they don't share the burden equally. Generally, labor supply tends to be less elastic than labor demand. It's more inelastic than labor demand is. So the Social Security tax burden would primarily fall on workers. Now let's think about sales taxes. Sales taxes are those that are collected by the retailer and are passed on to the government on the basis of the sales revenue. Sales taxes are very broadly defined. So when something is very broadly defined, consumers find it very difficult to avoid the tax by substituting their consumption. Demand, therefore, is quite inelastic as a general concept, so consumers are going to bear the greater burden of the tax. Now let's think about government intervention, but think about it as implicit taxation. This is where we can talk about things like price ceilings or price floors. Now remember, we talked about this in an earlier chapter. A price ceiling is when the government sets a price below the market equilibrium price. It acts as an implicit tax on the producers, and it's an implicit subsidy to consumers. It causes a welfare loss, which is that loss triangle that we talked about, just as you would have a welfare loss from taxation. An effective price floor is when the government sets a price above the market equilibrium. Now that one acts as a tax on consumers and a subsidy for producers. It's transferring consumer surplus to producers. So let's look at both of these. So here we've got a situation where we want to look at a price ceiling. A price ceiling is one that's going to be lower than the price on this graph, P sub naught. So if you've got a graph, if you've got a price that's lower than P sub naught, what's going to happen is you're going to get a price that looks like this. Now, we did have a producer surplus that was D, E, and F, and pardon me, guys, I just now noticed that they've got section E is actually labeled F, so that section that is to the right of section D should be an E. So the price ceiling effectively transfers surplus from the producers to the consumers, and something like this. C and E, what should be E, is the lost surplus. Now let's look at a price floor. Now here, a price floor, you're going to have a price that's higher than P sub naught. So what we expect to see is that surplus is going to be transferred from consumers to the producers. So let's let that happen. Here we've got the price floor set above P naught. Let's see what happens to the surplus. And we see that, yes, just as we figured, the consumers are transferring surplus to the producers. And again, we have a welfare loss in that section C and E. So the differences between the taxes and these price controls: price ceilings will create a shortage. However, taxes do not. Taxes leave people free to choose how much they want to supply and consume as long as they pay the tax. But shortages may also create black markets. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is a new concept. It's the idea of rent-seeking activities. And they're activities where groups deliberately try to encourage action on the part of the government that will transfer surplus to them from the other side of the market. So they may lobby for price controls, which transfers surplus from one group to another. They may try to lobby governments to institute policies that would increase their own surplus. Now, this is something that economists have discussed and talk about, and that they argue that the taxes and the benefits of government programs end up offsetting each other and basically become a wash. They don't help society significantly. However, they do cost resources involved in this rent-seeking activity. So let's think about when that may occur. If you've got inelastic demand, then there is a temptation on the part of people to lobby this rent-seeking behavior to increase their revenue. So let's think about this. If demand is inelastic, any increases in productivity that would cause the supply curve to shift to the right or outward would cause lower revenue for suppliers. So they may ask their lobbyists in Washington to try to counteract this incentive, this trend, by having the government restrict supply or create some type of price floor, thereby protecting their revenue. Generally, if small groups that are heavily affected by a government policy, we expect that they will lobby more effectively than large groups that are equally affected by the same policy. Now let's think about inelastic demand and incentives to restrict supply. So here we've got an example where the demand is inelastic. Notice it's fairly steep. Increases in productivity, just like we said, are going to affect the market. So we have supply that shifts from S0 to S1 because it's cheaper to produce the product due to those gains in productivity. So what happens to surplus? Well, as you see, we've got a change in a reduction in consumer, I said that wrong. We have an increase in the consumer surplus. No, I said, guys, let me back up. I just said that wrong and apologize for that. So they are going to lose the area A. The suppliers are going to lose the area A, but they're going to gain area B. Now, as you can tell, area A is larger than area B, so what would they want the government to do? They want the government to restrict supply so that they will have less of an impact on their surplus. Now, what about when they have an incentive to restrict prices? Now let's consider the situation where it's supply that's inelastic. Now it's the consumers that have incentives to restrict the price, not restricting supply, but restricting the price. We've got supply is inelastic and demand goes up. Consumers can be expected to lobby for price controls. Anywhere you have a city that has rent control, this is common in New York City, that's an example of this kind of situation. So let's think about these price floors and elasticity. Okay, with elastic curves, a large surplus is going to be created by the price controls. However, with inelastic curves, a smaller surplus is created. And we're using the term surplus here in terms of having more supply of a good than there is demand. So don't confuse that with consumer and producer surplus. So on the left, what do we see? Demand is fairly elastic. On the right, we see that on the left, we see that both demand and supply are fairly elastic. On the right, we see where both supply and demand are steeper and are fairly inelastic. So let's have a price floor put into place and see what happens. So here we've got a price floor. It's above the equilibrium price P0. And notice that when both demand and supply are elastic, the surplus, the difference between quantity supplied and quantity demanded, is quite a bit larger than the surplus that's generated when both the supply and demand are inelastic. Now let's think about the difference between the long run and the short run effects of price controls. When we have generally long run supply curves have elasticities that result in smaller price increases. Now that's simply because if you give people more time, they can begin to search for and find the substitutes that will enable them to avoid an increase in price for the goods they want to see. So the short run is going to have a very different response than the long run. So let's look at that on the graph. Okay, So here we've got demand has gone up for a good from D0 to D1. In the short run, in the short run, you see that we have an increase of quantity from Q0 to Q1, and we have an increase in price from P0 to P2. Now here's the long run curve. Remember, in the long run, there are more substitutability opportunities, and so we are able to lower the elasticity of supply, of demand. All right, so let's see what happens. Again, demand goes up, but notice what happens between the difference between the quantity change and the price change. In the quantity change, it goes up quite a bit from Q0 to Q2. In the price, it goes up from P0 to P1, a smaller increase than you saw in the previous slide. So here's all of them together. We've got the short run curve there, much steeper. The long run curve is flatter, and it shows these differences in changes in the short run and the long run. Now that brings us to the end of chapter 7. We've got a summary here. The consumer surplus talks about what that is. We've got the cost of taxation, and let me fill this in. That the equilibrium maximizes the combination of consumer and producer surpluses. We talked about taxes, which create a loss of consumer and producer surpluses. And then we talk about the cost of taxation, the deadweight loss, and the cost of administering that tax. And here we talk about how the relative elasticities determine who bears the burden of the tax. The more inelastic ones, demand or supply, the larger the burden of the tax. We also talked about price ceilings and floors and how they transfer producer and consumer surplus from one to the other. So we've gotten through the slides on chapter 7, and as we are going to get in the habit of doing this semester, we're going to discuss this when our normal class time. So again, what I want you guys to do is to read the chapter and go through the slides before class time, and then we will have used that time to answer your questions and to discuss it more fully. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate your attention.